Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is part 1 for What If Deku trained like Garou. Also check out the other videos on my playlist. But anyways, I hope you guys enjoy. Izuku was a 4-year-old green-haired boy with silver highlights on the side of his hair. All said boy wanted was to become a strong hero just like his idol, All Might. However, his dream shattered once he heard, "Sorry, you can't become a hero," said the quirk doctor without a care in the world. He pointed at Izuku's foot. "You see here, your son won't awaken a quirk, he has an extra joint." Izuku froze once he heard this. He won't be able to fulfill his dream, his ambition. His mother stared at her distraught son, who had tears coming down from his face. She frowned and glared at the doctor. Said doctor took a step back at the glare. Inko then shouted furiously, "How dare you shatter his dreams!" The green-haired woman shouted angrily. She stood up and smiled at her son. "Come on sweetie, I want you to meet someone." Izuku stopped his sobbing and stared at her in shock. He never seen her so angry, let alone yell at someone. The green-haired boy just nodded and grabbed onto his mother's hand. As they left, Inko gave one last cold glare towards the man, who gulped nervously, wondering what he did wrong. As the duo were walking to their car, Inko looked down towards her son. His hair reminded her of Hisashi and his father. He was also wearing an All Might shirt with black shorts and red shoes. She then stopped walking once she was in front of her car and bent down towards her son. Inko was now at eye level with the little boy. She smiled at him and lifted his head up so he could look at her. Izuku stared at his mother with puffy cheeks and red eyes. She then said in a motherly tone, "Don't worry Sochi, you can still become a hero." And as she said this, the green-haired woman wiped away the tears from her son's face, and she smiled once he stopped crying. Then stared at her inquisitively. He then spoke. But the doctor said I can't become a hero without a quirk." Inko nodded, that he did. Izuku deflated at this, but that's when Inko spoke up once again. "Well, what does he know who knows you can be the first quirkless hero? Now let's get you in the car, I want you to meet your grandfather." As she said this, Inko picked up her son and made sure he had put his seatbelt on. Izuku stared at his mother questionably. "I have a grandfather?" he asked curiously. After Inko heard this, she sweat dropped. "I must have forgot to tell him." She smiled and nodded, "Yes you do, and believe it or not, he was a pro hero at one time." Izuku's eyes went wide and he smiled broadly at his mother. Inko closed the car door and walked over to the other side of the car and quickly got in. 30 minutes later, Izuku had watched as his mother drove out of the city. She then drove through a forest, then continued to drive up a mountain. Inko parked her car and she looked back towards her son. "All right, we are here sweetie," she said with a soft smile. She got out of the car and helped Izuku to get out as well. Izuku stared at his surrounding in question. There were trees that were going down the mountain, and from where they parked, there was a stone staircase that looked like it goes on forever. Inko grabbed Izuku's hand and told him to follow her up the stairs. The green-haired boy raised an eyebrow and thought, "Do I have enough stamina to even walk up that?" And so he followed his mother, who kept holding her son's hand. Every 2 minutes she would look at him and make sure he was following. They had to stop about halfway because Izuku tripped and almost tumbled down towards the ground. However, Inko reassured her son that this is necessary and that she will make sure he doesn't fall. This went on for another 10 minutes of walking up the staircase. When they made it to the top, Izuku fell face first towards the ground. He shouted in victory, which sounded muffled, "I did it." Inko just smiled at her son and was glad that he was able to walk up the mountain. She knew Bang would make him do that daily, so might as well make him get used to it early. After she thought this, an older-looking man walked out of an old Japanese-looking building that resembles a dojo. The old man looked on at the duo and then he realized who they were. He smiled at his daughter-in-law and spoke, "Hi there Inko, it's been quite some time, is that your son over there?" After Izuku heard the man's voice, he looked up from the floor and stared at the man. Then stared some more, which made the man's sweat drop. He looked over towards Inko, who just smiled sheepishly at him. That's when Izuku shouted in realization, "You were Silver Fong." As he shouted this, he had stood up and pointed a finger at the man. Said man chuckled and moved his arms behind his back. Why yes young man, and what's your name? Izuku looked towards his mother and she nodded at him. He is your grandfather after all. The green-haired boy beamed at this and said, my name is Izuku Midoriya, sir. The old man chuckled and looked over at Inko. So I know you didn't come here just to introduce the little one here. He then continued. What was the reason you came to visit this old man? After Inko heard this she gestured towards her son. You see Izuku over there is quirkless and he wants to become a hero. Once the man heard this he put his hand onto his chin and stared at Izuku with a calculating gaze. He noticed how he was breathing heavy and looked a little worn out. So he already walked up the mountain at a young age, the man thought. He smiled at himself and nodded towards Inko. Very well, I know the reason why you came here and I accept. Izuku looked over towards his mother in confusion. Said woman looked back to her son and started to explain. You see son, I brought you here to ask him to train you. After all he is quirkless too. Izuku's eyes went wide and he stared at the man in shock. So he was able to become a hero even without a quirk. With newfound confidence Izuku vowed he would do the same. The man then spoke up. I was hoping to find a successor to my style and I'm hoping that you will become that student. Izuku smiled and nodded vigorously. He wasn't going to give up on his dream even if he is quirkless. Even if he doesn't have a power of his own, he will still become a hero. Bang nodded and told Inko he could train him Monday through Saturday. Said woman nodded and spoke after a moment. He still has school so you will have to figure out a training schedule for him. Bang smirked at this and said bring him back tomorrow, I will come up with something by then. Inko smiled and when they were about to leave Bang told her to wait. The older man then walked inside the building and started to write on a paper. He walked out and handed Inko the paper. She looked at it curiously and glanced back up towards her father. Who for his part, once he noticed her gaze he spoke. That's what I want you to do tomorrow once you arrive here. Inko just nodded firmly and gestured Izuku to follow her down the steps. Said green-haired boy muttered. Stupid stairs. However his mother didn't like him saying that word and chastised her son. As they were leaving Bang had a small smile at the sight of the duo. It must be hard for her to live alone with Hisashi overseas. But at least she looks happy. The next day. Word had got out that Izuku was quirkless and Bakugo wasn't too pleased to hear this. So now we are here. Bakugo pushed Izuku to the ground and shouted, I guess you are just a Deku, I don't want to hang out with some quirkless nobody. Izuku stared up at him with tears threatening to fall down. Why, just because I wasn't born with something I have no control over? After Katsuki heard this he halted for a moment but he shouted angrily, maybe it's because you're too useless to get one. And with that the blonde and his lackeys left a sad Izuku on his own. Said boy clenched his fists and thought to himself, I will prove them all wrong, and as he thought this his eyes lit up in determination. However Izuku didn't notice the gaze of Bang who watched the whole thing. He grinned and thought alright he will be one hell of a hero, probably even stronger than me. If his eyes are anything to go by, then as an afterthought maybe after he learns my style I can ask my brother to teach him his style as well. He then left towards the mountains. Now we skip to when Izuku and Inko reached said mountain. She looked at her son and hugged him. Alright, good luck Sochi, and as she said this Inko handed him a bottle of water. Izuku took the water and stared at his mother confused. You're not coming with me, he asked. The green-haired woman just shook her head in the negative. Bang told me to let you walk up there on your own. But don't worry, if you fall I will use everything in my power to save you. Izuku smiled and nodded. He stared at the staircase of doom and gulped. And with that Izuku slowly but surely made his way up the staircase. He made sure he watched his steps carefully to not fall. As this was happening Inko stared at his back worriedly. She didn't want to agree to this, but the green-haired woman knows if she doesn't let him go train on his own then his dream to become a hero wouldn't become reality. She almost ran up the stairs towards her son when she saw him falter for a moment but stopped herself. When she noticed Izuku had went on all fours and started to continue his climb up the stairs. Back with the green-haired boy, Izuku thought it's easier for me to do it like this, I can make sure I don't trip like this. So he continued with his crawl and 10 minutes later he made it at the top and landed face first onto the ground again. He shouted which was muffled. I did it, dumb staircase. Bang just chuckled at the sight and told the young boy to get up. Said boy did so and stared at what the old man was holding in his hands. It was white clothes with a yellow belt. Bang smiled and handed it over to his grandson. He then spoke after a moment. When we get inside, change into those, then we will continue your training. Izuku just raised an eyebrow and asked, continue? Bang just grinned at this and spoke. Well, when you walked up here by yourself, that's when your training began. As this was happening, Inko had drove away after she made sure her son didn't fall. Izuku nodded and followed the man into the dojo. Once inside, Izuku looked around and noticed it looks way bigger on the inside. He looked over towards the floor and saw that it was wooden. And above said wood was a training mat that was blue. He then looked around at the walls and saw that it read, Water Stream Rock Smashing Fist, in bold letters. Izuku stared for a moment longer at the writing. But Bang had brought him out of his thoughts. Go get changed, and when I'm training you, call me sensei. After Izuku heard this, he put his hand up in a salute and shouted, Hi sensei. And with that he ran over towards what he thought was the changing room, but as he left, Bang smiled. 3 minutes later, Izuku walked out of the changing room and rubbed his sleeve nervously. Bang raised an eyebrow and asked, What's wrong? The man questioned. The green-haired boy just meekly held out the belt and said, I don't know how to tie it. Bang just chuckled and bent down. As he did, the older man grabbed the belt and wrapped the said belt around Izuku's waist. He made sure to do it slowly so Izuku could follow. Once he was done, he stood up straight and put his hands behind his back. Did you see how I tied it? He asked. At Izuku's nod, Bang then smirked. Alright, now try and hit me. The green-haired boy stared at him in confusion. But what if I hurt you? He asked. After Bang heard this, he laughed. Don't worry about me, I will be fine. Izuku just nodded slowly and got into a weak stance. As he did, Bang was watching him, not uttering a word. Then after a moment he stared at the man as if asking for permission to attack. Said man just nodded. After he did so, Izuku ran over towards Bang and launched a punch to his stomach. Said man dodged to the side and moved his foot out and tripped the little boy. Izuku landed onto the ground with a thud. He pouted towards Bang and he just chuckled. Well, I never said I would stay still and let you hit me. Now you have to land a hit on me before the day ends, he said with a grin. Izuku smiled and stood up and rushed towards Bang again with a kick. The kick flew by Bang harmlessly and he spoke, make sure you leave no openings when you attack. After he said this, Izuku halted for a moment and wondered what he meant. The man just smirked and launched a straight kick in front of Izuku, who stared at him in shock for a brief moment. The green-haired boy saw a blue stream following his kick. After he saw this, he smirked at the kid. So he noticed that, did he? Izuku got into a stance once again and rushed towards the white-haired man. As he did, the green-haired boy launched a punch and as Bang dodged the boy, he spoke up. Make sure your punches are straight and move your whole body when you launch the attack. After Izuku heard this, he continued his attack and his punches got more sharper as he did. The retired hero had noticed this and thought, wait, I thought he doesn't have a quirk, he is improving at a fast rate. After Bang had thought this, Izuku had leg swept the man. And he fell onto the ground with a thud. Izuku huffed and was sweating a lot. He is only 4 after all. After launching all those attacks, his stamina was running low. Bang just stared at him in wonder. He then continued his thoughts from earlier. No, I don't think that this is his quirk, it's just him. I think this boy may be a fighting genius. As he thought this, Izuku was about to fall down towards the ground. But his grandfather had noticed this and caught the boy and stared at him for a moment. He then walked over to his phone and called Inko to come back to pick up her son. 30 minutes later, Bang was waiting at the bottom of the staircase, and that's when he saw headlights coming towards him. Once the light got closer, he noticed that it was Inko. Said woman parked her car near the man and ran over to Izuku. She grabbed him from Bang's arms and asked how did he do. The retired hero smiled and replied, Better than I thought. Your son will be fine, he is just tired. Inko nodded and thanked Bang. 2 years later. Izuku huffed as he stared at the 4 wooden planks in front of him. And Bang was at his side. Said man then spoke calmly, when you attack make sure your fist moves like a flowing river. He then continued, when you punch don't think about where the attack is going to land, just let it flow. That's why my style is called Water Stream Rock Smashing Fist. Izuku stared at the wooden planks and calmed himself. He put both of his hands in front of him and got into a stance. As he did this, Bang had noticed the small blue stream that was flowing from said hands. And with that Izuku shouted, Water Stream Rock Smashing Fist. He launched an attack towards the planks and broke all of them down the middle. After Bang saw this he grinned and spoke, now that you know this move your training is going to increase. Once Izuku heard this he paled at the thought, he already trains for 5 hours each day and gets picked up by his mother after. Now we skip 4 years later. Izuku was now 8 years old and he was now standing in front of Bang in the middle of the dojo. His appearance had remained the same. But he let his green hair fall down and now has a black belt tightly wrapped around his waist. The two stared at each other a moment longer. And without a second thought Izuku dashed towards Bang with his fist glowing blue. Said man dashed towards the green-haired boy as well. The two clashed and Izuku launched a high kick to Bang's stomach. Said man dodged the kick and launched an attack of his own, which was a straight punch. Izuku stared at the attack in shock. That was the fastest the old man had sent an attack towards him. He then put his arms up in a guard. After he did this the attack connected and there was a crack. Izuku flew back towards the wall and landed with a loud slam. Bang stared at where Izuku landed and thought, oops, I may have gotten carried away. Izuku moved the rubble that landed onto him to the side, and he rubbed the back of his neck. Wow, old man, you hit me pretty hard there, he said. Bang stared at him and noticed that his hair had more white strands. But he put that on the back of his mind for now. He then spoke after a moment. Yes, I am sorry, I didn't mean to put that much force into it. Izuku just nodded and grinned. Well, why don't we continue, he asked confidently. However, once Bang shook his head the boy frowned and was about to ask why. But that's when he spoke up, I want you to meet someone, and as he said this another man walked into the dojo. He then raised an eyebrow at the green-haired kid that was standing in front of a destroyed wall. Then at his brother, however his gaze turned into a glare. Are you trying to kill him, sending him through walls like that? After Bang had heard this he took a step back at the tone. But he then replied after a moment. I have been training him for years now, I know he would have survived. They were about to continue talking but Izuku spoke up. Gramps, who is this man, he asked questioningly. Side note, Izuku's attitude changed after a few years of people calling him a quirkless nobody, and throughout the years Bakugo kept trying to belittle Izuku. But the green-haired boy had always fought back, so now he is cold to those he doesn't know but still acts the same to those he trusts. Back to the story. Izuku stared at the man and he introduced himself. Hello there Izuku, my name is Bum. He then continued, I am Bang's brother. Izuku just nodded and asked, so why did you ask him to come? Gramps, he asked. Said man just said to watch. After he said this, Bum walked over towards a training dummy and got into a stance. He then roared while throwing a punch. Whirlwind Iron Cutting Fist. As he said this a red aura appeared around his fist and he punched the poor dummy. After the attack landed there was a sound of wood being cut and Izuku stared at Bum in shock. The wood had got cut into 3 different pieces. Bum then stared at Izuku and said, I will be teaching you my style. He then continued, Bang had told me great things about you and I want to see it for myself. Izuku stared at his grandfather who looked away flustered. The green and silver-haired boy just smirked and nodded. And so they trained like this for the remaining years until he is 14. The now silver-haired boy stared at his classmates and wondered when he can get out of this dump of a school. No one here likes him or talks to him, they all just ignore him and try to sabotage him, and some even tried to jump him. However, when Izuku broke their arms and defeated them all, everyone started to call him a monster or a freak. But Izuku didn't care, he knows what he wants to be. He then moved aside some of his hair and thought back to how it changed from green to silver. Izuku had asked his mom about it, but she didn't know either. The silver-haired boy then went to Bang, and the old man said he has a theory. Whenever he gets injured in a fight, his hair would change to silver. But that's all he had noticed when he trained Izuku. Izuku then grabbed a strand of his hair and saw that now the green was the highlights. He sighed and looked to the front once he saw his teacher enter the room. The teacher looked at his students and smiled at them. He then spoke after a moment. "You all are third years, you should think about your futures." However, after the teacher said this, he threw the papers into the air and said, "Who am I kidding, you all want to be heroes, right?" Everyone in class just cheered at this, and the teacher told everyone to quiet down. As this was happening, Izuku was looking out of the window and wondered when the class would end. But Bakugo stood up and was now standing on his desk, and the blonde shouted, "Teach, don't lump me in with these extras, they all will become sidekicks to some busted D-lister." He then pointed towards himself with a big grin. "I will become the #1 hero, and it all starts at UA High." After he said this, the class went quiet and some muttered, "Isn't that the national school?" After a moment of silence, the teacher spoke up. "Oh, and Midoriya over there wants to go to UA High as well." Once the teacher said this, Bakugo froze and glared towards his former friend. Then, as if a pin dropped, the class went silent again. They were all muttering, "The monster wants to become a hero." Some even said he will be better off as a villain. As they were saying this, Bakugo walked up to Izuku and launched an explosion towards his desk. Izuku noticed this and kicked his desk forward and made Bakugo fall onto it, which ended up making said explosion explode on his face by accident. The silver-haired boy just smirked at Bakugo and said mockingly, "You should watch where you step, Katsuki, you never know when an explosion will happen after all." The blonde glared at him for the jab and spoke in a cold tone. "Don't you think about becoming a hero? Yokai." Side note, yokai means monster, by the way. Anyways, back to the story. Bakugo said with a big grin. After Izuku had heard this, he twitched at the nickname but bent down towards Bakugo, who was still on his desk. The silver-haired boy was now at eye level with the blonde, and he spoke in the same mocking tone. "Why should I listen to someone who is weaker than me?" Bakugo roared and was about to launch an attack towards the quirkless monster, however the teacher stopped him. "Katsuki Bakugo, don't use your quirk to attack other students," he said sternly. He then spoke to Izuku with a scared tone, "And don't pick a fight with the bomber." Izuku gave a thumbs up at this and said, "Don't worry, Teach, I wasn't going to hurt him too bad." After the teacher heard this, he just chuckled nervously. And as this was happening, Bakugo walked back towards his desk, all the while glaring at Izuku. We now skip to the end of the school day. Izuku put his books away and was about to walk out of the class, but Bakugo stopped him. Everyone stopped to see what would happen. The blonde noticed everyone's gaze and smirked, "You shouldn't go to UA High." He then continued, "You know, all of the top heroes went to a no-name middle school, and I'd want to be the same." He then tried to put his arm over Izuku's shoulder. Big mistake. The silver-haired boy grabbed his arm and squeezed. Katsuki winced at the pain, and Izuku got into the blonde's face and spoke in a cold tone. "Don't tell me what to do unless you want another arm broken." As he said this, Izuku let go and shoved Bakugo to the side. Katsuki roared at his retreating figure and shouted, "They will never accept a monster like yourself." The silver-haired boy stopped at this and gave a half grin towards Bakugo. "And they will accept a walking nuke that has anger issues," Izuku retorted mockingly. After he said this, he continued his walk home. Katsuki just gritted his teeth at this and stormed off angrily, with his 3 lackeys following shortly behind him. Izuku walked out of the campus and made his way home. He wanted to change into his training clothes. The silver-haired boy wanted some tips from his sensei and train on his own at Dagoba Beach. As he was in his thoughts though, he barely noticed that the manhole beneath him had shook slightly. Izuku jumped back and threw his bag to the side. The villain looked around confused and wondered where the brat went. He looked up ahead and saw that he was 10 feet in front of him. "So you are a fast brat, huh? That's good, let me have your body, kid." "No." The slime villain grinned at this and said, "Well, you don't have a choice, brat." He then launched himself towards Izuku. However, as he rushed him, said boy dodged to the side and retaliated with a punch. As the silver-haired boy threw said punch, there was a red light. Then Izuku roared. Whirlwind, Iron Cutting Fist. The attack connected and cut the sludge villain in 3 separate slabs. Said villain had got knocked out due to the impact of the attack. Izuku stared at the sludge at his feet in disgust. He was about to walk away, but that's when he heard a voice coming towards him. The silver-haired boy watched as All Might flew out from the manhole and stared at Izuku in shock. All around the kid were sludge in 3 separate piles. He then coughed into his fist and spoke, "Well done, young man." Izuku just nodded and moved to the side. As he did, All Might disappeared and reappeared in front of Izuku while holding a bottle of sludge. "I want to say, to be able to defeat this villain that I was chasing is amazing." However, Izuku stared at him and asked bluntly. "Tell me, All Might, do you think I can become a hero even without a quirk?" he asked curiously. All Might halted at this and stared at the boy in front of him in shock. He thought that he had a quirk. After a moment of thought, All Might replied in a saddened tone, "No, young man, you should probably try to look for a different profession." He was about to continue, but Izuku cut him off. The silver-haired boy grinned at All Might and spoke. "Wow, even the number 1 hero is like the rest of the people Hugo figures." The silver-haired boy then walked off and said over his shoulder, "Don't worry, I will prove you wrong, fake number 1. All Might wondered why he sensed something off with the kid's change in attitude, and he regretted saying those words to the kid now. He didn't want the silver-haired boy to die while trying to become a hero. Though as an afterthought, I could have said that in a better way. But after All Might thought this, he jumped away. As he jumped away, he didn't notice the bottle that fell out from his pocket. 5 minutes later, Izuku walked out of his house and said bye to his mother. He had told her that he is going to run to Bang's Mountain. She just nodded and said, "Don't forget your electrolytes." The silver-haired boy laughed and said, "I have it right here, so don't worry." And with that, he closed the door and ran towards the city. If anyone were to see him, they would see a silver blur. After another 2 minutes of running, Izuku was passing through an intersection, but that's when he noticed the traffic up ahead. The silver-haired boy stopped and stared at the crowd that was gathered. Now, being curious, he walked over and listened into what they were saying. One of the people in the crowd were speaking to one another. "That kid has been in there for 5 minutes. I hope the heroes would do something about this," she said. The other one just nodded in agreement. And as they said this, Izuku looked over towards the villain and heard an explosion. Izuku walked over towards the front of the crowd, and once he was at the front, he would have laughed if the situation wasn't so serious. There in the center of the sludge villain he defeated Bakugo could be seen trapped inside. Then the two locked eyes, and Izuku chuckled at the pleading look in Katsuki's eyes. However, as he did, one of the bystanders had heard this and asked, "Why are you chuckling at a time like this, brat?" Izuku turned his gaze onto the man sharply, which made the man flinch. "Because I'm going to save that idiot." The hero that was in the front had spoke up though. "No, young man, don't interfere, you would just put yourself into danger." Izuku stared at the man and recognized him as Death Arms. The silver-haired boy scoffed and walked past the keep-out tape. He was now standing in front of the hero with a confident smirk. Then why don't you give me permission to help my friend over there? I'd already defeated that villain after all." As this was happening, the cameras turned over to the duo and were recording their conversation. Then as an afterthought, Izuku spoke while cracking his knuckles. "Though if you won't let me, I would still do it either way." Deatharm gulped at the hidden meaning and looked back towards the villain, then back at the boy in front of him. He nodded slowly and spoke out loud. "I, Death Arms, give you permission to fight." Once he uttered those words, Izuku grinned and launched off towards the slime villain, and he left a blue stream as he did so. He laughed and roared towards the blonde. I am so making fun of you for this later. Water stream rock smashing fist. After he said this, Izuku launched his hand into the sludge villain's head and it splattered on impact. Katsuki landed onto the ground with a thud. He looked up towards Izuku as he was coughing up some sludge and said, I didn't need your help. Izuku ignored him and walked over to his bottle and turned back towards Katsuki and spoke. You know that pleading look you gave me made me think otherwise. He then walked away with the heroes staring at the boy in shock. All Might, who was in the crowd, looked at the boy in surprise. That young man could be my successor. But he then thought back to their encounter and slumped down in defeat, though the kid probably doesn't like me no more. So I should wait before I ask him about that. He then thought back to the boy's words and grinned. Well, I will have time to make amends if he goes to UA. The next day, Izuku left his classroom and made his way towards the train station. As this was happening, everyone was giving him weird glances. Some of fear and others of respect. The silver-haired boy shrugged and glanced to his left. There he saw Bakugo staring at him intently. He had noticed the blonde following him as he left school, and told his lackeys to leave him alone. So he isn't going to try and jump me, huh? Izuku shrugged and put his headphones on. He isn't scared of the blonde. If Bakugo wants a fight, then he will give him one. As the silver-haired boy left the train station, Katsuki followed after him. And so this happened for another 5 minutes. Izuku stopped once he reached the beach and whistled. Wow, this is more of a dump than I thought. He then turned around and shouted. I know you have been following me, so just show yourself already. After he said this, Katsuki walked into view and looked at Izuku. He then pointed his finger at him and said 2 words. Fight me. After the silver-haired boy heard this, he sighed and dropped his bag onto the ground. He stretched and smirked. Yeah, I wouldn't mind a warm-up. He then glanced towards the garbage behind him and frowned. Katsuki was about to get into a stance and rushed towards Izuku for the jab, but said boy shouted. Hold on. The blonde raised an eyebrow and stood up straight and watched as Izuku walked over toward the trash. Once the silver-haired boy was standing in front of a broken car, he got into a stance and roared. Whirlwind, iron cutting fist. His attack connected and there was a boom. Katsuki coughed at the smoke, and once it cleared, his jaw dropped at the sight. The car and some of the trash behind it got cut into small pieces that flew into the wind. But you don't have a quirk, he shouted angrily. He then continued. Did you lie to me all this time? He was about to continue his rambling, but Izuku stopped him. I am 100% quirkless. He walked over to his bag and pulled out a folder. The silver-haired boy glanced at Bakugo and threw said folder towards the blonde. Catch. The folder hit Katsuki on the side of the face and he glared at Izuku. Said boy shrugged and said, I warned you, didn't I? He huffed and started to read. As he was reading, his eyes went wide and the blonde stared at Izuku in shock. This is the document of your quirk status and the weird hair change. Izuku nodded and caught the folder that Katsuki threw back towards him. He put it into his bag and got into a stance. All of my moves isn't from a quirk. It's from my own training. My grandfather was a pro hero, you know. After Katsuki heard this, he raised an eyebrow, all the while getting into a stance of his own. I never knew that, he said. Izuku responded back dryly. Because you always attack me and never talk to me, idiot. Then the silver-haired boy continued. Enough talk, let's fight. That's why you followed me here after all. After he said this, he dashed towards Katsuki and threw a high kick towards the blonde. Said boy jumped back and launched an explosive swipe towards Izuku. Said boy dodged to the side and roared. Water stream rock smashing fist. Katsuki's eyes went wide and tried to launch himself away, but he got caught in a flurry of blows from the silver-haired boy. Izuku kept the blonde in the air as he was attacking. Then after a minute, the silver-haired boy stopped and Katsuki fell onto the ground. He coughed up some blood and asked, did you really get this strong from training? The silver-haired boy sighed and rubbed the side of his head and plopped down in front of Katsuki. Yes. Katsuki stared at the night sky and muttered. I see. 10 months later. Throughout these months Izuku had cleared out the beach, and surprisingly enough, after a week Katsuki started to join him. The blonde would always ask for a spar, but it would always end in the same result. Looking at the sky with blood coming from his mouth. Though after a while Katsuki was able to land a few hits on the silver-haired boy and sometimes even almost win. The two wouldn't call each other friends, but Izuku knew that the blonde was the closest thing he has to one. And now the two boys are standing in front of UA High for the entrance exams. But that is the end of this part. If you enjoyed this part, leave a like and subscribe. Also let me know what you guys think of this in the comments.